All right, it is now my pleasure to bring to you Miss McKenna Themm and her paper, An Insatiable. Chandler Themm. Oh, no. Sorry about that, big sister. All right, here we go. We'll try it again, all right? It's my pleasure to bring you Chandler Themm and her paper, Insatiable Pursuit.
From the beginning of a person's life, there are certain desires that ingrain themselves into the deepest parts of one's heart. What begins as a childish endeavor evolves further into the pursuit of a man. A pursuit which is all-consuming, passionate, relentless. Not a single person is exempt from the desperate predilection within, uniting all of humanity with the same ambition: to attain wisdom, to know the truth, and to be happy. Each ambition is powerful, valuable, and even priceless, with the potential for great excellence or great destruction. Such aspirations are embedded, established deep within one's nature, requiring no inculcation of force, for these deeply instilled desires are innate, as is the pursuit to attain them. The unrelinquishing desires for wisdom, truth, and happiness are so powerful within that they become the subliminal motivation to every action, the very purpose of life, yielding a pursuit that is incessant and insatiable. Wisdom is an aspiration whose nature is moral and decent. This deeply rooted desire is not lustful, but honorable and edifying, sought after by the most virtuous of people. Yet, man is capable of distorting even the noblest of pursuits. Thus, the perversity of the human heart distorted the purity of desired knowledge and caused mankind's own destruction, turning the noble pursuit of wisdom into the evidence of humanity's corruption. It began soon after the creation of man that desire for knowledge turned instead to lust. It all began with a forbidden piece of fruit which represented the insecurity inside the first man and woman, their inferiority. A serpent came to them, clothed with deception, and subtly uprooted the promises which they knew, the words the Sovereign One had spoken to them. He made acquaintance with a woman called Eve, and rumored to her of a tree that held the potential of greatness in its fruit, a tree whose fruit would transform those who took it, for the simplicity to be made like God. Intimidation grew in the heart of the woman, and her inferiority produced insecurity, and her weaknesses overcame her. The fruit represented the possibility of greatness, of knowing everything, and it called to her, "So eat thereof your eyes that seem so clear, yet are but dim, shall perfectly be then opened and cleared, and you shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil as they know." So Eve took of the fruit and shared it with her husband. For one fleeting instant, knowledge was within their grasp, and as their fingers grazed its shiny surface and their lips touched the sweet exterior, the life source of their spirit was taken, and eternity was placed to shame. They were driven by their envy, led to disobey the one thing God desired of them, cursed to live a life of shame and separation, all because the enticement of knowledge was too strong to be overlooked. The unappeasable demand for wisdom has been since interwoven into the essence of humanity, every man desperate to know, to be wise, and the prospect of wisdom being grants to sacrifice whatever it takes to gain it. Truth and wisdom are vital for human life, the center and foundation of sincerity, and a life deprived of them knows only lack. Truth is the light which illuminates everything, and those who live without truth aimlessly stumble through darkness. With the metaphor of the cave, Plato used darkness to represent ignorance and the meaninglessness of life without truth. The darkness was home to those who dwelt within the cave, and it engulfed everyone inside. The darkness manipulated the little light inside, and the minds of those who dwelt therein, creating illusions out of shadows, distorting what was true with a facade. The mirage of images that appeared on the walls was a superficial imitation of what was true, a mockery of truth that made fools out of men. One would stand with their backs to the light and their face turned towards the things which it illuminated, so that their eyes by which they saw the things which stood in the light were they themselves in darkness. The people inside the cave were bound by their ignorance, consumed by the darkness, confined in their deprived state. Each of them was hindered from availing the truth except one. One person was liberated from the chains of his demarcation and guided out of darkness into light. And for the first time, he saw reality for what it truly was, and it was profoundly painful. His immersion into light led him to anger and anguish. The overwhelming brilliance of light brought pain to his eyes, which had adapted to the familiarity of darkness. As his eyes began to open, he was shown the objects whose shadows he had once known, and was overcome with disbelief that those objects were the source of what he had seen. He learned for the first time that something that was real, and it caused him pain and grief. He wrestled with the pain until his eyes adapted. Pain and anger eventually grew into familiarity and fondness. Now liberated from the solitude of darkness, his eyes were open to the world which was illuminated. He saw things for what they really were. Truth and understanding replaced the chains that once bound him, and he made acquaintance with the water and its reflections, with the shadows of people, with the moon and the stars that illuminated the night sky. The radiance of light was no longer full of pain or confusion, but was warm and enlightening, and he found it superior to the life he once knew in the cave. He remembered the misery of life in the cave and the impersonation of the shadows which feigned reality. He decided to return in hopes that he would lead the prisoners out of the cave into freedom, into the light. However, upon his return into the cave, he was blinded by the overwhelming darkness, and those who were inside saw his pain and inferred that his journey was harmful and should never be taken again. Often this is the effect of truth when one has grown accustomed to living in darkness. The exposure to light is excruciatingly painful and unfamiliar, but once one emerges into that brilliant light, it far exceeds any illusion darkness could create. Once one has been permeated with the light and rested in her presence, retreating back into darkness is just as agonizing as leaving once was. Likewise, abandoning truth after experiencing the liberation it holds brings only torment and misery of knowing the light, yet being chained to darkness. Anything that is worth obtaining often costs the familiarity and comfort of what one has always known, with the promise of something far greater waiting just beyond one's sacrifice. The familiarity of what one knows is powerful, and stepping into the unknown is something many people never accomplish. But those who do are rewarded with enlightenment and life that far exceeds the ignorance which they took comfort in. The greatest threat to wisdom is contentment in ignorance, but so often one chooses immediate satisfaction over the benefits that come from seeking more. Foolishness finds companionship with complacency, because those who remain content in their ignorance will never know the abounding fulfillment that truth holds. Once the man ventured out from the cave, the brilliance and exuberance of light compelled him to bring truth and light back into the dark places he once lived. For once he had experienced the light, he would never be able to live happily in the dark. Such is the effect of understanding and truth on one's heart. Once someone is relinquished from the grip of ignorance and falsity, they will never again find satisfaction in either. For once one has lived in the light, they will never again find refuge in darkness. Truth is embedded in the fundamental principles which pattern and shape one's life. Every thought one attaches to their beliefs, every opinion one is willing to defend, and every value integrated into one's morality is composed of and embedded with truth. There is a portion of truth in everything one stands for, whether one knows the truth and then commits themselves to it, or one knows the truth but lives in denial of it. The quality of truth is not an imposition nor a restraint on joy. It is not an obstacle put intended to hinder our happiness. Rather, finding truth and knowing truth is a pursuit given by the grace of God, and every gift of God is good and perfect, with the opportunity to bring him glory. The truth always has a way of making itself known, but the test of good character is in those who reveal the truth before it reveals them. Finding truth is a righteous pursuit, and in order to obtain it, one must exchange their earthly desires and lust for blamelessness and the pursuit of righteousness. Pascal ponders this and advises, I would then lead man to the desire of finding truth, to be free from passion, and be ready to follow it where he may find it, knowing how much knowledge is obscured by passion. Truth is applied quality that has no affiliation with emotions. It is not objective to certain situations, it's certain and unchanging. Passion cannot be reconciled with truth, because emotions are not the ultimate truth, they must submit to it. A life of following passion yields seasons of exhilaration, but feelings are not that which sustain a lifetime of contentment. Finding truth requires the pursuit to imitate the value itself, and being genuine, authentic, and uncompromising. Truth demands the sacrifice of desires that would render it unsuccessful, nullifying any incorporation of desire and honoring only what is derived from knowledge and logic. Pascal also writes, "We desire truth and find within ourselves only uncertainty." One's inability to fully achieve absolute certainty is humbling, an evidence of man's depravity and desperation for a God of truth. Once awakened, the longing to know the truth of heaven cannot be quenched or replaced. An evoked passion for truth brings one to a place of awareness that everything means nothing without the one who created it. St. Augustine recalled a time in his life where the desperation of his heart cried out, confessing, "All my empty dreams suddenly lost their charm, and my heart began to throb with a bewildering passion for the wisdom of eternal truth." Truth is a tempest. Once you awaken such a light, it will penetrate through every shadow of darkness, illuminating everything surrounding it. Even truth's farthest echo is a roar, searing through every expanse of silence, demanding to be acknowledged, to be known. Deep inside each of us there is a spirit restless until it may know the one who designed it. That spirit knows the truth, knows love, knows joy and peace, and knows the one who created each of these, and it desperately pushes us towards the divine. That's why a lie is not received without contention. A lie sparks a reaction that goes deeper than emotion. It triggers the spirit within us, urging us back to truth. However, as much as we rely on truth and cherish her, our relationship with truth is of a very conditional nature, for we love truth when it serves us, but hate it when it betrays us. We demand to be told the truth at all times, but find exceptions as to when we should be honest. As St. Augustine writes, "Men love the truth when it bathes them in its light. They hate it when it proves them wrong." People love truth when it serves their purposes. When it cannot be manipulated for their own good, they disregard it. The pursuit of truth requires a heart of humility, for the pursuit of truth is humbling, constantly bidding one to continually sacrifice their own inclinations towards dishonesty. For truth to withstand the temptations and pressures of secrecy and dishonesty, it must be paired with humility and the full realization that without being led by Christ, one's pursuit is in vain. After one's salvation, their transformation shapes them to be like a vessel, where the Spirit is welcomed and honored. Once the Spirit has been welcomed, the fruit of that Spirit is evidence of the Holy One in our lives. Thus, truth is not only a righteous pursuit, but the evidence that one has been made new in Christ. Truth is the corroboration and manifestation of our stepping into a new life. Allowing truth to prevail in our lives is a testament of worship and gratitude for what was accomplished on the cross. Happiness. Happiness is the subliminal motivation and priority of every human action. No man is exempt from the desire to be happy, for it is what ultimately drives every person to do what they will in their life. Every pursuit, dream, ambition. As Aristotle writes, happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Happiness is not a frantic afterthought. It is the ambition and purpose behind every choice one makes. Being prompted and influenced by the prospect of happiness and inclined to any potential of receiving joy. It is the ravenous, consuming desire for joy that aches within our souls, dimming all other desires and rendering every other pursuit unsatisfied. It is the most sincere, wholesome desire in each of us to be happy. No one pursues misery, and certainly no one takes pleasure in their discontentment. Yet, somehow it seems that in the endeavor to be happy, most people discover what they'd so desperately hoped would bring them joy was not what they hoped for at all. For this reason, wisdom must be reconciled with joy, that happiness may be attained and enjoyed. For the fruit of wisdom is abundant life. Wisdom is protection direction and guidance, and desires to be sought after. Wisdom is bestowed without limit and lavished upon those who love her. Wisdom is found in the sacrifice of every treasure or possession, for her worth far exceeds any cost required to attain her. For the fruit of wisdom is that which never fades. Her beauty only grows richer, and her worth only increases. Lack of wisdom leads only to a life of ignorance, and ignorance is the deprivation of joy. For wisdom is more than knowledge, but is the very source of a life with meaning, of a life with joy. True joy cannot exist without the wisdom to enjoy it. As Themm once said, wisdom is by far the greatest part of joy. The mighty words of the proud are paid in full with mighty blows of faith, and at long last, these blows will teach us wisdom. Thus, wisdom must be bound to joy, that happiness should be acquired and never cease. True happiness is unending, but for anything to be without end, the source of its supply must likewise be without end. One would expect fulfillment to be in the mere things, aiming to find joy among a multitude of possessions. But in order to have constant, unwavering happiness, the provider of that happiness can never change nor falter. For the weakness of humanity is that we seek happiness and find only misery and death. We cannot but desire truth and happiness, and are incapable of finding certainty or happiness. Within one's own means, one is fundamentally incapable of ever being able to satisfy oneself completely. For if one had the ability to be content within himself, there would be no need for goodness beyond himself. He would define the limit of happiness, the extent, and ultimately the cause. Yet, wish as he might, no man has the ability for such contentment, or to provide such happiness for himself. Although he is incapable, the desire remains, thus producing an unquenchable longing, turning the desire to achieve happiness into restlessness. Such restlessness becomes a torment that drives man to seek out happiness in whatever temporary gratification, leading only to failed attempts and hopeless prospects. For the restlessness which persists cannot be satisfied by human effort nor anything of this world. The restlessness that stirs inside man has but one cure, one solution. The only one who is worthy of our adoration, the only one who is holy enough to be praised, the only one whose love is so strong it was worth the sacrifice of his own son. Until one's heart is united with the one who created it, one will never find peace. As Pascal writes, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in thee." There is a Creator whose love is so strong that estrangement from that love produces the deepest kind of heartache and pain too extreme to bear. His heart is at the very core of all he created, interwoven into every aspect of those he carefully and thoughtfully created with deep, unending affection. When one is apart from that intimacy, there is no peace. The purpose of life was union with him, and until mankind is reunited in his fullness, the torment of being without him persists within. Eternal relationship invites me, reconciliation of father to child, where true happiness begins, the only source of satisfaction. As St. Augustine recounted, joy in God is not like any pleasure found in physical nor intellectual satisfaction, nor is it just as a friend finds in a friend. But if we are to use any such analogy, it is more like the eye rejoicing in light. Joy in God is like emerging from a life of darkness into brilliant light, an experience which is incomparable and irreplaceable. The sweet, wholesome satisfaction in the Lord is to rejoice in you, for you, and because of you. This is true happiness, and there is no other. Those who think there is another kind of happiness look elsewhere for joy, but theirs is not true joy. True joy is found in the goodness of every aspect of the Creator, in who He is, His unfathomable grace, which reconciles all who are lost and broken into His eternal kingdom. There is no alternative to such happiness, no fulfilling imitations or replicas, and those who believe there are deceive themselves and further deprive themselves of ever truly being happy. and it is the living God, who created all things from the outpouring of his heart, making man the focal point of his affection. To gain wisdom, to know truth, to be happy. A pursuit which yields the greatest of all treasures. In every vain human attempt and every hopeless end, one is led closer to the fulfillment of the desire which was within him all along. The relentless pursuit, a divine aspect of humanity, for the end of the pursuit has but one resolution. The greatest climax of human life, and the most extraordinary aspect of one's existence is unveiled at the end of such pursuit, the living God discovered. Thus, it is in the pursuit called faith that one finds absolute certainty, wisdom that goes beyond comprehension, and happiness that never ceases. One is led not to a material entity, but to what one strived for all along, God alone. The endeavors and pursuits are fruitless because what is sought can be found only in him. He is the foundation and focus of one's deepest desires. It is not admiration of a mere quality or value, but of the one who possesses it, one who defines it, one who embodies it. The persona of God is what one desired all along, the intimacy of knowing him more, the assurance of his promises, and the abounding joy that he brings. Thus, the end of one's insatiable pursuit is found in the sacred simplicity of knowing his affection.
Thank you very much, Miss Themm. I would like to begin with a quote that you had from the Theban trilogy. The specifics are important, so I am going to take a moment and find exactly where that was. All right. Okay. You had this quote, you said, true joy cannot exist without the wisdom to enjoy it. As Antigone says, wisdom is by far the greatest part of joy. The mighty words of the proud are paid in full with mighty blows of fate. At long last, those blows will teach us wisdom. Being that, given your thoroughness of study, you are obviously aware that that quote comes from the chorus and not Antigone.
Right.
That is, you're putting it into Antigone's words in an attempt to convince us that Antigone is wiser than she is.
Not necessarily. I suppose in the case of Antigone, it was the chorus, kind of observing from the outside perspective of Antigone's life, and I think that's often what it is. In our instance, there's people outside your life, and it's sometimes easier to look into someone's and see their flaws and their lack of courage, their lack of wisdom. You see decisions they're making, and you're like, wow, wisdom could really be of use to you right now, which I think is kind of what is emanated from the chorus, as they're saying wisdom is necessary for her joy, so it's not necessarily to make Antigone appear wiser than she is, but I guess just that perspective of other people being fully aware of her state and what it is that's necessary for her to really find joy.
All right. Throughout the paper, you've looked at the concept of happiness and that being the pursuit of wisdom. And I can't think of another better way of putting this, but when I was growing up, I had a brother who always loved to master a game and then ask me to play it, being 5 years younger than him, and beat me at it. And it's pretty much, it's pretty obvious that he always wanted me to play his game. And you're obviously a very good student, somebody who loves wisdom, and your definition of happiness as wisdom, if you remember Aristotle saying God is thinking, kind of the philosopher's God, are you perhaps not giving us the philosopher's vision of what happiness is? In contrast, could we not say that happiness is a well-sung song, having a nice piece of chocolate, enjoying a walk on the beach, having your tutor remember your name. Is happiness, you seem to give a very philosophic definition of happiness, and is that perhaps not, creating an understanding of happiness after your own image?
Right. I guess this is something, your question, that I've wrestled with personally, because I do think that there's this overwhelming sense of God's presence in happy moments of walking on a beach or seeing a sunset, and just these moments that are irreplaceable and that are priceless. And I do believe that that is true happiness. And I believe that happiness is attained through the presence of God in those moments, the significance of His beauty affecting us. So while there is like a philosophical side to that happiness, I also wholeheartedly agree that without wisdom, happiness just isn't the fullness of what it could be. You see people doing foolish things and they're happy in that moment, but wisdom is what sustains that joy. And I think wisdom, maybe bound to happiness, might be the key, not necessarily one without the other, because I do think that there is happiness in insignificant moments, maybe where you're not thinking and racking your brain on what's the smartest thing to do. But I do believe that for true joy to endure a lifetime and an eternity, it comes with the wisdom of God to be able to see it.
Mm-hmm. You talked of ignorance as being one of the great sources of man's misery, and that the pursuit of wisdom is one of the things that man needs to strive after and to work towards. And you have the statement, you say the greatest threat to wisdom is contentment in ignorance. And another statement later, you're speaking of a wiser man, you say he would never be able to live happily in the dark, but the wise man must always seek wisdom. Is there not also a limitation of the wisdom of seeking wisdom? We were just in Dante this past week, and in Dante's Hell, he gives a description of the end of the life of Odysseus. And it's a very interesting description. He describes Odysseus at the end of his life, desiring he has to have another journey. And he has to go out into the ocean and discover things that have never been seen before. And that he has to fulfill ambition. And he goes out past the Strait of Gibraltar, out into the Atlantic, and his boat sinks and all of his crew dies. And that's the end of the life of Odysseus. And it's Dante's image of the ambition of knowledge. That knowledge can be taken too far, and when we go outside of the realm of what we are to know and to understand, and we have this insatiable desire for knowledge, that we can actually destroy ourselves that way. And so at what point is happiness the contentment of not knowing? Being able to know that you do not know and being able to be content with that.
Right. I think as far as the extent of knowledge, there is something to be said about being content. But I think in relative to like personal relationship with God, I think as you grow in your relationship and in spiritual maturity, and as you're in the Word and growing, that wisdom is something that's just bound to that and grows relative to it. Because wisdom is available to us. I think the more you press into who God is, the more He gives you wisdom, and the more He pours out His heart and His perspective and just the mind of Christ upon us. And so I think in a vain human attempt to find knowledge and just to grow, I guess, selfishly, I think just to seek out understanding for the sake of knowing more and for the sake of being great, that there is an end to that, and that there should be, because I think you can maximize how much you know, but it's all futile in like the great scheme of things. But I think when you're in relationship with God and what you're seeking is His heart and His wisdom and what He says, that there's so much grace over that, because it's not in vain. It's completely a pursuit of just the heart of God. So I don't think in that way that there is an end, because I think it's something God lavishes upon us without extent and without limit.
Mm-hmm. One more question, and I'm not going to quote the verse very well, but in Ecclesiastes there is a verse that says something to the extent of, to the reading of books there is no end, and to the extent of knowledge it is a misery. And often as a teacher, I've thought about that verse and thought about perhaps limitations of that. Could you say anything more on what a real detriment learning can be?
Being raised by a teacher.
My children suffer from a similar
Right.
affliction.
I mean, our incentive to learn to read at 12, 2 years old? How old? Yeah, at about 2 years old was alphabet cookies and gummy vitamins. So learning is kind of something that's been instilled in our family and something that's been fostered and cultivated my entire life. So I do have just a deep love for learning, and I love reading. We have hundreds and hundreds of books, and I think the detriment is in learning and in hearing people's perspectives and in studying these philosophers, whether they have a Christian worldview or whatever it is that they believe, is it's hard to learn without having the lens and perspective of Christ, because I think once you do, and the more you take in perspectives, you kind of forget what it is that you believe. And I think that's probably the greatest detriment, is to learn what everybody else thought of life and what everybody else experienced in the world and attaching that to your belief, because you've spent your time learning and in books and stuff and not actually doing it for yourself. So I think the greatest detriment of knowledge is that in seeking more, you kind of lose yourself.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
Yeah.
Your paper, so good.
Oh,
Kind of got
thanks.
goosebumps a little bit. So I was wondering, you talk a lot about wisdom, and
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could give kind of like a clear definition of wisdom, and if you think it's different from like just intelligence.
Yeah. Okay, so I think in like the framework of my paper, when I say the word wisdom, it's more in a biblical context, and it's just kind of in the context of relationship with God, because I do believe that as you are in the Word and as you are growing in your relationship, wisdom is just like an outpouring of that. And I think as you grow, your wisdom is only enhanced and like grows as well. So I'd say wisdom in the perspective of not like knowledge, whereas knowledge might be like book smarts, if that makes sense. Like intelligent people can be seriously brilliant. Whoever finishes Euclid all by memory, like that's intelligence to me. But I think you can have intelligence without wisdom. I think you can be smart and still neglect the heart of God and neglect what His Spirit leads you to. So, yeah. Yes.
Really lovely job. The way you're using language is really beautiful.
Thank you.
So my question for you is, you brought up Antigone.
Yeah.
And so my question for that would be, so we follow the story of Oedipus, who's very much a man who searched after the truth, but it destroyed his life.
Right.
So there's arguments to be made for it. His life would have never been found anyways. But is there a point at which the search for truth becomes an idol in of itself, or tears
Yeah.
it up?
No, absolutely. I think anything out of proportion can be destructive, at least in like a human being kind of way, where you're seeking something out. Like Oedipus sought the truth, and it literally led to his destruction, like you're saying. And I think in that way, anything out of proportion, and anything that kind of radically takes over, and it literally consumed his perspective, it consumed his life. Everything was changed because of the desire for truth. And I think if you put anything into that situation, whether it's good or bad, it can destroy your life. Yeah.
So kind of basing off what both those questions were about, Molly was saying, asking what wisdom was. Bella was mentioning how there might be too much of something. So my question is, like for knowledge, like, knowing Euclid in and out like the back of your hand, is that futile? Or is truth futile? Or is happiness futile if you don't have wisdom? Or are those things still good? Like, so I know we, not a society, I think it's a general truth that older people have more wisdom,
Right.
But so as younger people, is it futile to search for knowledge and truth and happiness without that wisdom?
Right. I think I'd say no, to some extent, because I do believe I had quoted in my paper the passage in the Bible which says that every good and perfect gift is from above, and so I would say that truth and happiness, knowledge, I think those are all beautiful things that God gave to enrich our life, and I think accessing those and pursuing those is not futile, because I think developing knowledge and developing understanding is just honoring something God gave us. He gave us a mind to be used, not to just blatantly follow along with whatever people say. So I think it's good to establish those things because they are what God intended, I don't think He gave us anything to not be used. So I'd say those are good things, and to pursue them is definitely not futile. But as far as neglecting wisdom in pursuit of those, I think that's where the destruction is, in pursuing those things and leaving wisdom behind. I think you need to always let wisdom kind of be the forefront of what's on your mind and what's on your heart, and everything else kind of follow under that and filter through that, using wisdom through knowledge, using wisdom in happiness, using wisdom in truth. It's just kind of the guide to everything that I feel that God has given us.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
From time to time, we come across people that seem to be on a path of unhappiness and wanting to make everybody around them unhappy as well. What do you say about that in terms of kind of this universal principle of pursuing happiness? How does that situation fall into that framework?
Right. So in my paper, I had quoted how we all do desperately seek happiness, and it does seem often unfair. There's people who just are constantly unhappy, and they have good reason. They've had miserable lives, and there's just so much that they have to be angry about. But I think happiness is more than an emotion. I think happiness is a decision, at least in the sense that God has joy for us to reach always. It says in Galatians 5, when he's talking about the fruit of the Spirit, that there's love and that there's joy. And I think when you step into a relationship with God, all of those things we have access to. And I think at times there's grief and there is pain and suffering in our lives, but God's promise is that there's always a way for us to reach the joy that He has. So I would say in the case of there is people unhappy, but there's always an intentional decision to make to be happy and to have joy and to be just in the fullness of God. And so I guess when you're not in a relationship with God, I think that's where it truly is just there's no hope until you're in God to ever make yourself happy for any amount of time. Yeah.
Really enjoyed it. So Mr. H and Ella kind of alluded to this, but more specifically, so I'll quote you first. True joy cannot exist without the wisdom to enjoy it. And a little bit further down, he said, thus wisdom must be bound to joy, that happiness should be acquired, never cease. So there's the phrase, ignorance is bliss, that I'm sure you've heard. And as most people would conclude, the happiest people that we can see are children, young children, because they don't know about the complexities of life. And also, the same case could be made of someone like Oedipus, who, before knowing truth, he could have lived a much happier life, at least from the way we could have seen it. Another example would be Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Arguably, their desire for truth kind of made their lives far more unhappy than if they had chosen to remain ignorant. So you say that wisdom is bound to joy, but couldn't the case be far more made that wisdom and joy are almost non-compatible or in opposition to each other?
Right. That's a really good point. I kind of say then maybe that wisdom and joy are the two family members at Thanksgiving that don't get along well, but they're always together. I think that I think that there's something to be said for like the ignorance is bliss. Like you do see happy children, completely carefree, running around, having the time of their life, and like there's nothing like more beautiful than that like picture of joy and that laugh that they have. But I think in like the great scheme of things, I guess I wrote my paper through more of like an eternal perspective, because while that is beautiful and while Adam and Eve were blissful, I don't think I can say that bliss and joy are the same thing. I do think that bliss is like a temporary gratification, which I think in all of your instances might be the case over true joy, because we can be happy in a moment in ourselves, in something we provide, but I need to say that true joy is accessed in eternal relationship with God in heaven, and without wisdom and without the wisdom that salvation brings, I don't think that that can be attained. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
How important is humility in your pursuit of a relationship with God?
Yeah, huge. I think that humility is a center and a core pillar of a relationship with God, because there's always something in our flesh that kind of is fired up as soon as you're confronted with something that needs changing. And I think that's what maturity in a relationship with God is. There's always things He's trying to correct and refine and chisel off all of our rough edges just to be completely shaped into His image. And I think without humility, that's where we get maybe even stagnant believers who are so set in their ways that they're unwilling to change anything, even though it will benefit them. I think faith without humility is like completely useless. You need to constantly humble yourself and be willing to change and just be made into the image of God. Yes. Sorry. Okay.
More so just a clarification question.
Yeah.
So you keep using like joy and happiness in the same context.
Mm-hmm.
I personally have always thought of those being as like two separate things, like happiness more so as like things on earth that are more monetary and joy being more like that decision that you're talking about.
Right.
So just kind of like your thoughts on that and clarification if you are
Yeah.
kind of using them in the same context.
Okay, so, yeah, I'd agree that happiness is definitely more like the emotional state of the word that I'm using, and joy is more like the eternal value. But I do think that, I would say joy is like the grandfather of happiness. Like happiness is a like subset of joy. I think it's derived from joy. I think that true joy is manifested through happiness. So I do mean joy is like the eternal, and happiness is something that we have access to now, but I don't think they're completely unlike. I think that happiness, they're really different.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so another one that I was thinking of when we were talking to Josh about the bliss of Adam and Eve,
Right.
is that like, would you say that they almost lost wisdom that day because they knew God, but then they gained, so what
Yeah.
would you distinction?
Yeah, I think that is interesting. Because of the state they were in, like is said to be perfect. God had everything. I mean, just being in the presence of God is all we could ever truly want, right? And so I would say that yes, wisdom was lost, but I would say that losing any part of God's character in that significant a way to be torn from a relationship and like literal union with Him, to be in His presence, I think that was a great loss of everything that man could desire, not just wisdom. But I think that's just such a testament to the graciousness of God that He would still allow us to pursue Him and have access to those things even after our decision to step out of that.
Okay, and then what I would ask from there is, so if they sort of had wisdom, and they have now the knowledge of good and evil, what is learning about the nature of sin, is that a foolish endeavor because they didn't know about that?
So you're saying like, is learning about sin?
So like, how we discuss, basically like, I think of how to phrase this, when we discuss like the depravity of man, is like examining that a foolish endeavor.
I don't think so. I think it's good to constantly like put ourselves in check and to self-examine, self-evaluate. Like, this is what I think we all have like a natural inclination towards sin, obviously, just deep within our nature. And so I think being aware and conscious of that is important. And I think that's a huge step in identifying that we do need a Savior constantly and just bringing ourselves back to that all the time. But I think it's good within a limit, because so much self-examination of, wow, like I'm so imperfect, I'm so broken, I'm such a sinner. Like, I don't think that's the heart of God at all for us. There is meant to be an awareness, but I don't think it's ever meant to like control us or just, be that deep part of inside us. Yeah.
So, how much would you say that God communicates with us? Like, both how does He communicate with us, and then also just how much does He communicate?
I don't think there's any limit to what God will say. I think as you press into Him, His heart was always for us, and Him being with us, I think, is just the greatest desire of His heart. So I don't think that God ever has a limit on like, oh, you've maximized your prayers for the day, sorry, talk to you tomorrow. I do think that there is always, if you are willing to step in, He will meet you every single time. But I think, to answer your other question, that God, He is without limit. He's outside rules or anything that we could like make up in our mind of what would be normal. So I do think there's like prayer, and I think that reading your word is how you do like to see the heart of God in a very real and a very personal way. But I don't think that He's limited to meeting us in nature and in the beauty of what He created and in simple conversations and insignificant moments. I think He's there, and I think that He's always ready to speak to us, and He is always speaking to us. Yeah. Yes.
So, I was just wondering, this is more just like a clarification question, I guess. Or not even clarification, but just like your opinion on this. I was wondering why, when there's like a bunch of things that people kind of strive after, like, glory, and you can name a bunch of virtues, why did you choose these three in particular, being like the universal almost?
That's a good question for sure. I suppose I was definitely coming out of like my perspective of my life and just things that have been very evident to me throughout life, throughout the church. I think that there's just, I don't know if I've ever met somebody who's exempt from any of these things. I've never seen somebody not want to know the truth, not want to be happy, not want to be wise. And I do think there could have been so many other things added to that, like you point out. But I'd say those were just the most prominent to me, and yeah. Yes. Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Chandler.
So I have a question about the allegory of the cave.
Okay.
When it seems like a lot of this striving towards wisdom and that relationship with truth is a lot of a personal journey and something someone chooses to do on their own. If you're someone who has been in the cave, has been chained, and has purposefully decided to go out and see the light in its entirety, what is that person's role in relationship to the people who are still in the cave and possibly don't know they're in the cave because they haven't maybe seen the light or haven't had their awakening yet? Is it their responsibility to have their own awakening, or is there some sort of responsibility on the part of someone who has seen the light?
Yeah, that's good. I think as for the person who did leave, he saw the fullness of everything that he didn't know existed, and it was so compelling to him to return and to tell people. And I think, like in comparison with like the church and our role as Christians, I think that should be the heart of every Christian is we've all emerged from a place of darkness once we stepped into salvation, and our role, I believe, is to return into that dark place. and to bring the hope of Christ. And I love the part of the allegory of the cave where he returns, and because he's like returned back into like that darkness and that fog, everybody there is like, wow, that was like horrible, we never need to do that again. And I think that's so often the case in Christianity, is like we come in with this good news and our heart is just for the message of Christ to be shared, and people are like almost like turned away from it from the start. But I do think that it is absolutely the role of somebody who's been transformed by the power of Christ to bring that love into other people. And I think that's the role of each of us. Yeah. Yes.
So this is another question related to the allegory of the cave.
Yeah.
I guess, so the allegory kind of presents itself as a pretty simple kind of way, because, you know, the light is like super obvious when contrasted to the darkness. However, life ends up seeming to be a lot more complex than just light versus dark.
Yeah.
How do we know when we're seeing light versus when we're seeing a shadow?
Yeah. Wow, that's good. I think that just comes in to incorporate wisdom into just an everyday life kind of way, where it's our lens and our filter, because I do think there's so often these imitations that look so realistic, and we're compelled to them because what we desire is the truth that's behind that, but it presents itself as something that it's not. And I think that's where I'd say like spiritual discernment kind of help us in using our wisdom in prayer and just being intentional about not being so eager towards an inanimate object or towards something that's presented to us. Not becoming so enamored with that whether it's true or whether it's false, that we just take it for what it is because we want it so deeply. Yes.
So, since you said that happiness and joy is more eternal value, is happiness a man-made emotion, or is it actually genuine?
I think that's a good question. I think happiness is genuine. I think there is authentic happiness that we experience throughout our lifetime. And I don't mean to say that happiness cannot be eternal, because I think once we're in the presence of God and that we are experiencing heaven, I think that there will be a happiness that's beyond any expression and any words. I just mean it in the context that it's more of an emotion and not necessarily something that's permanent, like a permanent value as joy.
Other questions? Do you have any questions from the onliners?
Yes.
So, let me see if I can get this straight.
Okay.
Happiness is kind of the immediate, you're in the presence of good things, you're enjoying them in the moment. And joy is, even when you don't have those good things, even when you're suffering, you make an intentional choice to have joy, to find the best in it, and even if there's nothing good to be found, to still rejoice in the fact that, that God's still there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that what you were?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Themm.